Good evening, and welcome once again to Inside Creative Writing. I'm Robert Olin Butler, and this is the second night of this project in which I'm writing a short story in real time on both the web, the internet, and on Dish TV. And what you'll be seeing tonight, as you saw last night, those of you who are coming back for a second time, what you'll see largely will be my word processor as I create a short story. And it began last night absolutely from scratch. We've made some progress. We're a little over 400 words into the story now. And if you are joining us for the first time tonight, and indeed you may have seen this project mentioned today in the USA Today newspaper in the Life section, and you may be joining us as a result of that. Publishers Weekly also covered us today, and you may be a bookseller. God bless you, and welcome. Wired Magazine also. So we are gathering some attention, and I hope that you've come ready to examine in the fullness of detail the creative process. I'm going to do the best I can to articulate some of the things I'm doing, perhaps provide a little bit of a running commentary to the best of my ability without compromising the trance state that an artist must get into in order to come into contact and fully explore his or her imagination, the unconscious, or as I've been describing it, as the dream space. For those of you who are with us for a second night, I may repeat myself at times for the sake of those of you who are coming in for the first time. But I will repeat myself appropriately because some of the issues that I began to articulate last night will be recurring themes in this process. Themes that bear repeating over and over and over again. If you were one of my students here at Florida State University, and this is my office at FSU, you would know that I speak of certain basic issues of process over and over and over again. So you may hear some repetition as you come back again and again, but these things bear repeating. Now, if you are here for the first night, the homepage for the Inside Creative Writing project that you came to in order to get to this broadcast, if you go back there at your leisure, you will find a calendar taking up much of the lower half of the page. And on each date of the calendar, the dates that have passed, and I'm referring specifically to last night, you'll find an icon or a line of type which will allow you to choose your connection speed and then to replay the webcast of last night and as we go forward of any given evening. So you will always have access to these webcasts. You can replay them at your leisure. You can replay them over and over, or if you've missed some, you can go back and pick them up when you wish. You'll also find in the calendar an opportunity to examine where the story stood at the end of each of those days. And the comparison of those, I think, eventually will be fruitful for you. And, of course, there's a large icon on the page to see the story so far. And that's what we're going to pick up with today. And once again, you will have the opportunity, again, by way of that homepage of Inside Creative Writing, you'll have an opportunity to send emails to me through the evening. And one of my graduate students, indeed, is downstairs at a computer, ready to receive those emails, questions, or observations that you'd like to make, all but suggestions about what to do next. Those I will respectfully decline, because, as I mentioned last night, the creation of a work of literary art is not a collaborative process, and so what we're trying to do here is reproduce for you what is normally hidden behind the veil of private life, and that is the fully elaborated moment-to-moment process of creating a work of art. So email me questions. I will spend the last half hour or 45 minutes this evening answering your questions, and I'll be delighted to do that. You will also find on the Inside Creative Writing homepage the image that I've chosen to be the inspiration for this story. It is a picture postcard. And as you will see, if you go back to that and click on it, you will see an image of a fragile-looking biplane, its wing visibly tearing. And that card was a real photo taken by someone. And that someone now is the narrator of the short story that I'm writing. And he had written on the back of the card, "This is Earl Sant of Erie, Pennsylvania, in his aeroplane just before it fell." I think it's time now to, on this Halloween night, with a full moon yet, it's time to knock on the muse's door and begin. As with last night, getting my moccasins on, just to, normally I write in my home in a much more casually rendered situation, and at least now I can get out of my street shoes and be comfortable. I also, as I mentioned last night, I use music to help focus my work, and I turn that on now as well. I read aloud often. Voice is very important to me. I write, have written in recent years almost entirely in the first person. And this story's inspiration has certainly located itself in a voice. All of the stories in this book of stories I'm writing from these picture postcards are going to be based on voices coming off the backs of the cards. And to return to my dream space, I will read aloud what I've written so far, which is a thing I do even in the privacy of my study. I do a lot of reading aloud. And I'm married, by the way, to a wonderful fiction writer, Elizabeth Dewberry, and we often will read to each other at night after the workday is over, and to have that sensitive and sympathetic and ear present allows me to see what's going on in the text that has come from my unconscious even more clearly. I've seen a man die, but not like this. There was silence suddenly around us when he disappeared beyond the trees. Silence after terrible sounds. That hammering of his engine, the engine of his aeroplane, and the other sound after. He had climbed miraculously up and he had circled the field. There's a shift in time here, and so I'm now paragraphing. He had climbed miraculously up and he had circled the field, and all our hats came off as one, us men. That slight vernacular awkwardness there, I've paused a couple of times on the us men, but I pause not necessarily because it's wrong, but it's certainly it's a moment when I think indeed I hear his voice even more clearly. The naturalness of his speech, the slight awkwardness of it, and also his sense of connection to the others in the field. That's something I'm noticing now. It may be important. My son cried out too. Hooray, we cried. And Earl Sant hammered overhead and down to the far edge of the pasture, defying the trees, defying the earth. The propeller of his engine spun behind him, and he sat in a rattan chair, as if he was on his front porch smoking a cigar. Then he came back from the tree line, heading our way. I touched my son on the shoulder. There's no sense of how old he is, and this touches on the youth of his son. I reached down and touched my son on the shoulder. I had never seen an aeroplane, and I confess it scared me some. I had no premonition, but I needed to touch my son, and the plane came toward us, and there was a stiff wind blowing. The plane quaked a little, like a nervous horse. I stopped on this word last night, too. The plane bucked a little like a nervous horse, but Earl kept him. This sounds too familiar at this moment. But Earl Sant kept him steady, kept him coming forward, and I felt us all ready to cheer. Again. The plane bucked a little like a nervous horse, but Earl Sant kept him steady, kept him coming forward. And I felt us all ready to cheer again. Commas for me are very important. I do not adhere to strictness of comma rules. Commas are pacing tools, rhythmic tools. Commas for me are ways of joining images, impression, details together, or slightly tapping their difference, their separation. And his perception of Earl flying here does not get blended into the man on the ground. He's very conscious, our narrator, of the separation of this man and this machine from the rest of them. And so that comma taps that sense of the separateness, that this man up there is doing something we cannot do. And so the absence of the comma was wrong, and the comma is right here. I reached down and touched my son on the shoulder. I had never seen an aeroplane, and I confess it scared me some. I had no premonition, but I needed to touch my son. I needed to touch my son. He did have a premonition, in essence. The but contradicts himself. Which is why, and you heard me last night rail against the willed thing, the analytical thing, and that's why I had no premonition is not an abstract thing. Because dramatic irony is at work here. We hear in the but the fact that he did have a premonition. The subtext then is quite sensual in that it's revealing our narrator's personality. I had no premonition, but I needed to touch my son, and the plane came toward us and there was a stiff wind blowing. The plane bucked a little like a nervous horse, but Earl Sant kept him steady, kept him coming forward, and I felt us all ready to cheer again. Then there was a movement on the wing, with no particular sound, still the engine, but there was a tearing away. If I had been Earl Sant, if I had been sitting in that rattan chair and flying above these bared heads, I might have heard the sound. And been afraid. He's trying to touch Sant's feelings now. I lifted my camera. This had nothing to do with the thing happening on the wing. I was only vaguely aware of it in that moment. I lifted my camera and I tripped the shutter, and here was another amazing thing, it seemed to me. One man was flying above the earth, and with a tiny movement of a hand, another man had captured him. He was about to die, but he was forever caught there in that box in my hand. And now I'm wondering if the he was about to die is ambiguous. Technically, the antecedent is himself, another man who had captured him. But somehow it doesn't read that way. One man was flying above the earth, and with a tiny movement of a hand, another man had captured him. I better place strictly here. This is how, in working through the grammar, non-grammatical things can suddenly present themselves. Our narrator is experiencing the moment of seeing this plane in some sort of momentous way, and even then, this new technology in his hand as well. One man was flying above the earth, and with a tiny movement of the hand, another man had captured him. But when we get to the declaration of the death to come, our narrator returns to Earl Sant's name. It's a very personal thing. Earl Sant was about to die, but he was forever caught there in that box in my hand. I lowered my Kodak, and for a moment the plane was before me against the sky, and all I felt was a thing that I sometimes had felt as a younger man, riding up into the Alleghenies alone. And there would be a turning in the path, and suddenly the trees broke apart, and there was a great falling away of the land. Falling. He fell, Earl Sant. The airplane pitched its face forward. The aeroplane pitched forward, and for a moment it seemed to stop and to hang there. And the engine hammered on, and then it fell, disappearing behind a stand of pine. Now, one of the things I do somewhat frequently is count the words. It helps me keep a sense of the proportions of things, and then each night I will see where I start from, so I can determine how many words I've written for that evening, and also, indeed, to see how many words are in the next unit. All right, it's time for me to shut up now and try to find what's next. I just want to make sure that felled is right. Some things that you feel comfortable with, yes, to fell, to cut, knock, or bring down. Some things that you know quite naturally seem strange to you in this state of mind. And you find yourself occasionally verifying the most obvious things. The language takes on a kind of strangeness at times like this. I don't know quite how to explain it. But when you're in your unconscious, you begin to, you re-examine words in ways that you hadn't before. You sort them and weigh them and measure their valences. In terms and with motives that are new to you. And difficult words, or words that you had never thought to use, come to you readily sometimes, and words that are quite common to you in certain ways feel strange. And so Of falling, he fell, Earl Sant. The aeroplane pitched forward, and for a moment it seemed to stop and to hang there, and the engine hammered on, and then it fell, disappearing behind a stand of pine. There was a heavy thump there beyond the trees. Too many there's. There. The airplane pitched forward, and for a moment it seemed to hang against the sky. And the engine hammered on, and then it fell, disappearing behind a stand of pine. There was a heavy thump beyond the trees, and I have nothing in my head to compare it to. Not a barn collapsing, not a horse going down, not the dead sugar maple I had felled only this morning in our yard. The sound was new, and our silence followed. We all of us could not take this in. He had flown this Earl Sant. He had raised his goggles to his eyes and stepped into this machine, and he had run along the meadow and had lifted into the air. And now I looked into the empty place where he had been only a moment before, as if my eyes had been the shutter of a camera. Of course, the eyes weren't the shutter. Now, do I want to get into lenses and all that crap? No. It's a very easy metaphor and a distraction. But maybe there's a slight confusion left here now. Is it enough to say I could see once more the two great wings and the spinning of the propeller, and then he was gone? In my head, I could see once more. The two great wings and the spinning of the propeller, and then he was gone. Papa. It was my son's voice drifting up from the silence. I looked into his face, turned up to me. My hand was still on his shoulder, and I felt his bones. which lay still. That's not right, which still lay. I'm wondering now if we need to name the son yet. The narrator has remained nameless so far. I'm hearing his voice, and that's all that's important for me right now. I do not independently seek out until it's time, until I need it, the other details of his life. His name, for example. He would not call his son by name here, or would he? We may yet learn the narrator's name. Obviously, this is not the moment. And the question is, do we learn the child's name first? And there's no reason not to, really. The narrator's very conscious of Earl Sant and his name. He's holding onto the name as if it's a gesture of avoidance of the fact that the man is dead, in a sense. Now I've got one of those little awkward things. If I could, stay here, I said. I guess it's automatically understood that he's speaking to his son. I was inclined to say, stay here, I said to my son. But then I let go of my son and turned to the place where Earl Sant had vanished. If I stay here, I said to him. There's a way in which one might read that as him speaking to Earl Sant, at least for a brief second, causing the sort of dysfunctional confusion that grammar's meant to avoid in syntax. Okay. Let me back up. There was a heavy thump beyond the trees, and I have nothing in my head to compare it to. Not a barn collapsing, not a horse going down, not the dead sugar maple I had felled only this morning in our yard. Not the dead sugar maple 40 foot high I had felled only this morning in our yard. The sound was new, and our silence followed. We all of us could not take this in. He had flown, this Earl Sant. He had raised his goggles to his eyes and stepped into his machine. And he had run along the meadow and had lifted into the air, and now I looked into the empty place where he had been only a moment before. In my head I could see once more the two great wings and the spinning of the propeller, and then he was gone. Papa, it was my son's voice drifting up from the silence. I looked into his face and turned up to me. It's all right, I said, though I knew it was not. I could feel my son's bones beneath my hand, which still lay on his shoulder. Got this my son problem, don't I? These little spots drive you crazy. I looked into his face, turned up to me. It's all right, I said, though I knew it was not. I feel still compelled. I feel as if the narrator would be very conscious of his son's physical fragility at this moment, and so I'm fighting to keep that. I'm going to skip these same bits that I did last night. Working with music, you need to keep the mood appropriate. There we go. All right. His hand is on his son. And seeing this man die before him in this way that he had not imagined, he had not anticipated. The world had not yet anticipated, in a way. It's all right, I said, though I knew it was not. What is this boy's name? At least I should know it at this point. beginning of the last century, my understanding, names often came from the Bible. Names that were so common when I was young had persisted from the beginning of the century. Although it's interesting, in looking at these postcards that I've been collecting, there are names that have fallen from fashion. Women's names mostly. Minnie, for instance, very common. But what is this boy's name? I have Name Your Baby books. There's probably a website here, but I think we can do this. I think I can do this in another way here. Papa, it was my son's voice drifting up from the silence. I looked into his face, turned up to me. It's all right, I said, though I knew it was not. I could feel Matthew's bones beneath my hand, which still lay on his shoulder now. Yes. He speaks his son's name for the first time in the very moment when he's feeling he is very vulnerable. So the naming here in the story, but the name comes in the same way that Earl Sand's name has come to him. Papa, it was my son's voice drifting up from the silence. I looked in his face, turned up to me. Up, 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 and away. It was my son's voice drifting up from the silence, turned to me. We already know he's below him, so we don't need that. I looked into his face, turned, lifted to me. It's all right, I said, though I knew it was not. I could feel Matthew's bones beneath my hand, which still lay on his shoulder. He's gone, my son said. They're lifted. Lifted, lifted. Looked, looked. These crazy little functional words that drive you nuts. I looked into his face, lifted to me. Okay, here we go again. As you can see, I like to revise as I go. Now, a lot of writers at this point put down approximations, let those things go. And that's fine. That's another way to do it. Perfectly legitimate. For me, I feel the need to struggle with the language as it happens. And maybe getting used to doing that is what allowing me to speak to you. Because you understand how schizophrenic this is, don't you? I know you do. To be in the trance and then to step back from it and address you and to let you know what's going on. But I think I've, in a way, interestingly, just on a verbal level, I've always done that, because a little bit of the crude struggling with the repetitions of simple words, as I'm doing right now, reproduces that pattern of being in that deep trance, and then coming up to a higher, a kind of shallower level of it in order to cope with, which is often just crude spade work, to cope with this little crap. So, all right. And our silence followed. All of us could not take this in. He had flown this Earl Sant. He had raised his goggles to his eyes and stepped into his machine, and he had run along the meadow and had lifted into the air, and now I looked into the empty place where he had been only a moment before. In my head I could see once more before, starting to rhyme, which is another thing that can drive you crazy. Let's see, once again. You heard the before more that time. I did. And our silence followed. We all of us could not take this in. He had flown this Earl Sant. He had raised his goggles to his eyes and stepped into his machine. And he had run along the meadow and had lifted into the air. And now I looked into the empty place where he had been only a moment before. In my head I could see once again the two great wings and the spinning of the propeller, and then he was gone. Papa, it was my son's voice drifting up from the silence. I looked into his face lifted to me. It's all right, I said, though I knew it was not. I could feel Matthew's bones beneath my hand, which still lay on his shoulder. He's gone, my son said. I looked to the others. There was a stirring. Mother of God. You know, I'm going to let the look stand for now. It's far enough separated. I looked into his face. I looked to the others. I don't think I have an actual problem with that. Sometimes you imagine, you perceive problems just by the way it looks on the page, when in fact, in the reality of it, in the sound of it, in the rhythm of it, it's maybe not a problem. And vice versa. It looks okay, perhaps on the page, but when you hear it, when the rhythm of it, the sound of it happens, something's wrong. And it's those things, as I said, that I really feel the need to deal with on the spot and at the time. Now, it's not going to be perfect. The gestalt of the story is going to dictate, it's going to have implications down to often the most simple level. And you'll know that effect only once the story's done, but tentatively, I like to make things as right before I go on. Okay. He's gone, my son said. I looked to the others. There was a stirring. Mother of God, one man said, and he began to move in the direction of the pines. He was right. We had to do something now. I let go of my son and turned to the plain where Earl Sant had vanished. Place. I let go of my son and turned to the place where Earl Sant had vanished. Stay here, I said. Did I call this thing a meadow before? Yes. I want to check fuel. By the way, I've been using this dictionary, and some of you have asked for me to repeat the name of this dictionary. It is the Merriam-Webster. It's my favorite dictionary. I use the Oxford English Dictionary off the website I have access to here at Florida State University. And honestly, if you don't have that kind of access, it seems to me it's worth the investment to subscribe to the online edition of the OED, or to get yourself one of those little micro print editions that float around. You can find in used bookstores now and then. The dictionary that I use is the Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary. The current edition is the 10th edition, especially if you need to know when words come into the language, because it gives the years. And it's the only American English dictionary that does. Now, it's been drawn to my attention overnight that there is an online version of this, and I'm going to go there right now just to see. Yep, here we are. Now, I know you may not see the screen very well, but I'm just going to put in fuel. And way old, 13th century, certainly. Now, if I wanted to see where the nuances were dated, the OED is really the choice for that. But this is so common a word, I think I'm just wasting time. You'll find, by the way, and I know I tell my students about this, sometimes when you slide out of the trance, going into your unconscious is a scary as hell thing. And when you slide out of your trance, you may fiddle around with words just to not have to go back in. Or you may find that suddenly that your fingernails need clipping. You need to resist that impulse. My fingernails need clipping, but I will not do it now. You're helping me in that respect. So I need to quit fiddling around with fuel here and get back into the flow, back into the space. I let go of my son and turned to the place where old Sant had vanished. Stay here, I said. We ran, perhaps a dozen of us, across the meadow grass and into the stand of pines. We ran, perhaps a dozen of us, across the meadow grass and into the pines, and I could smell burning, and there was smoke up ahead, and I could smell a newly familiar thing, a smell of the automobiles. Okay, I'm going to need to see Earl's body. I don't see it at the moment. Our narrator is going to see it. Must see it very clearly. I let go of my son and turned to the place where Earl Sant had vanished. "Stay here," I said. We ran, perhaps a dozen of us, across the meadow grass and into the pines, and I could smell burning. And there was smoke up ahead, and I could smell a newly familiar thing, a smell of the automobiles that had come to our town, their fuel. By the way, I've gone after the casual and repetitions of words. The looks and whatever, those words that were working words, that were words denoting or identifying, defining the just relationships of things and the movements of the character's eyes or whatever. Now, I'm not seizing on the repetition of smell here. This is a different matter. We ran, perhaps a dozen of us, across the meadow grass and into the pines, and I could smell burning, and there was smoke up ahead, and I could smell a newly familiar thing, a smell of the automobiles that had come to our town. There's a difference between this and the words that I had changed earlier for their repetition. The repetition of smell here is a function of his emotional state. He repeats the smell. I could smell this, and it was this kind of a smell, and it was that kind of a smell. He is overwhelmed by this sense of this, literally the sense. It's a deeply shaping sense impression of this event. And that repetition here, for me, to my mind, to my sensibility, to my sense of voice, and to my aesthetic, that repetition is a good repetition. It's driven by the emotion of the situation, and the thing repeated draws our consciousness to the senses and to the sensual experience that is there and very insistent. There's an insistence to it, which is apt and in this context. We ran, perhaps a dozen of us, across the meadow grass and into the pines, and I could smell burning, and there was smoke up ahead, and I could smell a newly familiar thing, a smell of the automobiles that had come to our town, their fuel. Then we broke into a clearing, and the aeroplane was crumpled before us and beginning to burn. I was behind several of the men, and we were in our Sunday clothes. This paragraphing now, it's the rush into the thing, into the clearing, the sense impressions. It was beginning to burn. Feel the shift here. He's pulling back a little bit. In a way, hiding. by letting himself be conscious of the fact that there are other men between him and this terrible thing. And he pulls back even farther emotionally now, moving to how they were dressed. And of course, they're inappropriately dressed for the task before them. But you can see how it's a way of him not seeing really what's happening beyond them. And that's why it was going to be a crucial kind of moment for me to try to let him see that. I too, being in his sensibility here, I'm reluctant to look. And, you know, fully elaborated gory details of this would not be the appropriate thing either, but we have to see it together, he and I. But I feel him now pulling back. I was behind several of the men, and we were in our Sunday clothes, and we had left our churches this morning, and had come to see the exhibition of this wonderful thing, and now we were stripping off our coats and winding them around our hands and arms, and two men were ahead of me. And they trying to get to Earl Sant. I hitched around. I came around them. By the way, notice the little technical thing here? There's a thing you can do with the past perfect. The whole story is being told in past tense. Now we've shifted to an earlier time. I had not seen his face clearly before. Once we establish that, you can slide into the simple past tense, and we understand what's going on. And in a way, it imitates the way in which, as you enter into a memory, it is distant to begin with, and as you get deeper into it, it becomes as if it's now, the now being the simple past tense. I had not seen his face clearly before. He was out on the edge of the meadow, and he waved at us from his machine and lifted his goggles. I bent to Matthew and drew his attention to this man who was about to fly. I'm still not satisfied with the way in which he first engages Sant's brokenness, his body. And we've now written over 400 words tonight. Let's just go back and review. 400 words is a good evening's work, and I feel like the words are coming well. I have to say I liked what I felt in those first 400 words. And now let's take it up from where we ended last night. There was a heavy thump beyond the trees, and I have nothing in my head to compare it to. Not a barn collapsing, not a horse going down, not the dead sugar maple 40 foot high I had felled only this morning in our yard. This sound was new, and our silence followed. We all of us could not take this in. He had flown, this Earl Sant. Now you might ask why we none of us. Again, the kind of raggedness of the vernacular feels right here, and his sense that he's part of a larger community here of men in this field. And it seems like mostly men who came out to watch the plane in this 1913 setting. And our silence followed. We all of us could not take this in. He had flown, this Earl Sant. He had raised his goggles to his eyes and stepped into his machine, and he had run along the meadow and had lifted into the air. And now I looked into the empty place where he had been only a moment before. In my head I could see once again the two great wings and the spinning of the propeller, and then he was gone. Papa, it was my son's voice drifting up from the silence. I looked into his face, lifted to me. Which was lifted to me. It's all right, I said, though I knew it was not. I could feel Matthew's bones beneath my hand, which lay on his shoulder. He's gone, my son said. I looked to the others. There was a stirring. Mother of God, one man said, and he began to move in the direction of the pines. He was right. We had to do something now. I let go of my son. And turned to the place where Earl Sant had vanished. Stay here, I said. We ran, perhaps a dozen of us, across the meadow grass and into the pines, and I could smell burning, and there was smoke up ahead, and I could smell a newly familiar thing, a smell of the automobiles that had come to our town, their fuel. Then we broke into a clearing, and the aeroplane was crumpled before us and beginning to burn. I was behind several of the men, and we were in our Sunday clothes. We had left our churches this morning and had come to see the exhibition of this wonderful thing. And now we were stripping off our coats and winding them around our hands. And now we were stripping off our coats and winding them around our hands and arms, and two men were ahead of me, and they were trying to get to Earl Sant. I came around them. I had not seen his face clearly before. He was out on the edge of the meadow, and he waved at us from his machine. He's already made reference to that moment, and he's going back to it. He's returning as memory does and re-examining another element of it. This little moment in retelling this, he's avoiding still looking clearly. He's not ready to look, and that's why I'm not ready to look. But he's trying to understand this man, as a human being, somebody who nevertheless, who he did not know but had died in this way. And the issue of his face, which he had not seen clearly, and still hasn't, I think. Although we'll see, I'm not sure. But anyway, this feels okay for the moment. In other words, I had not seen his face clearly before. He was out on the edge of the meadow when he waved at us from his machine and lifted his goggles. I bent to Matthew and drew his attention to this man who was about to fly. All right. This last little bit. Tomorrow, I'm going to begin with the challenge of coming to see this site. And it may well be that a little of this will change, but certainly up to here, I feel comfortable for the evening. And we are now at (853) words. Having done 418 tonight, which is a pretty good night. Okay, I think it's now time to turn to the questions. Now, I have a question or two left over from last night. And as one of my graduate students makes his way upstairs here to bring the questions of the evening, let me deal with a couple of them from before. From Maeve in Los Angeles. How many rewrites do you usually do before submitting a piece of fiction, and how much emphasis do you place on the rewriting process? Well, you do as many rewrites as is necessary, but I think her question here, and I probably had her question somewhere in the back of my mind when I made that little observation in the midst of writing tonight. For me, rewriting comes, much of it comes, the deep, the basic spade work of the rewriting, and not just mechanics, but rather really focusing on getting the images right, the character nuance right, all of that I need to feel is shaping into its ultimate organic shape as I go. Other writers who do full rewrites more commonly, and I will do a full rewrite if necessary, but I don't generally find that necessary in my work. And here's my assistant. Come on in, Andrew. Oh, Willie, great. How you doing, man?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Good. This is my one of my wonderful graduate students, Willie Hobbs, and I thank you so much. We have some more questions tonight.
Quite a few.
Thank you. We'll see you. So, the other option is to, as you write, to make approximations and to end up with a kind of sprawling, largely approximated draft. And then you go back and re-engage the fullness of that rewriting task. For me, rewriting comes line by line by line by line first, and then I work it over in full when it's done. But rewriting, of course, is extraordinarily important. And it's important also for me to try as much as I can to make that rewriting process flow not just from a kind of analytical observation about how things are working or not working. In fact, I suppress the analytical aspect of that and not just keep it in check. I don't want to give you the implication that the impression that I think that very much of that kind of analytical thought is the appropriate way to do rewriting. For me, rewriting is redreaming. That when I feel the places are wrong, it's not a matter of stepping back and intellectually analyzing what's going wrong. It's a matter of sensing where something is wrong and then re-engaging the unconscious, redreaming that passage. Rewriting is redreaming for me. This is from Melanie Hobson. I wonder how you reconcile this project, which seems very controlled, that is writing on demand at specific times in a specific location, with your theory, belief of the white-hot center, the dreamscape, the subconscious. How can those things be connected with at will? Is this a contradiction? It's a very good question, and it's one I think, again, I've had your question sort of at the back of my mind also tonight, Melanie, and I hope you've been watching the actual writing, because well, let me tell you this. You should understand, and that's sort of obvious, but you know, I don't sit in my room talking to myself like this when I'm writing in the private way that I have always written, and that all of us do, right? But what I'm articulating could well be, you might well assume, however, that what I'm articulating are actual thoughts that I have non-vocally when I'm writing. And I want to say that that's not true either. What I'm doing is articulating something that never gets, even internally, into a place of being articulated. I'm giving voice in the commentary I give to what I perceive as the instinctive, sense-based, emotional, intuitive decisions that I'm making. Very quietly, not in my rational mind, but in the same dream space where the words are coming from. I have to say I went home last night feeling very odd and in some ways unsettled. I've mentioned the trance state before, and Melanie is right to wonder if you can, on demand, go into that space. Now, by the way, the problem of going on in demand has to do, it seems to me, not with, as Melanie puts it, writing on demand at specific times in a specific location. Indeed, I think those things are important for a creative writer. I think it's very important for you to establish a daily writing schedule. All fiction writers who aspire to art must write virtually every day. Now, as you may know, I'm taking Saturdays off. And eventually you'll learn your own rhythms, and you may well take one day out of 7 off. And you'll be unfit company for anybody, and you'll funk around. And so I shall on Saturdays. I'm not going to be partying in a free-spirited way. The story will still be working on me, but I will just not go there for the one day. But honestly, if I let 2 days go by, maybe I could get back to it without a lot of torment. But if you let 3 or 4 days go, even for me, on the 4th or 5th day you go back, it's as if you've never written a word before in your entire life. The demands of going into the artistic unconscious are so severe and so frightening and so difficult and require concentration of such a magnitude that if you don't go there every day, the way in seals itself back up, and no matter how much you've written, as I say, it feels like you've never written before. And so you need to keep that link going. Once you begin your writing project, once you begin a story or a novel, you need to write every day. Very important. And writing at a certain time every day, making that a part of the rhythm of your life, a necessary part of it, is very important, very good. So to that extent, writing on demand at specific times, specific location, not only is that not a hindrance to getting into the white hot center, it's a very important method of doing it. This other thing, however, going into that white hot center and writing, it's the trance state I've talked about is something that the athletes call being in the zone. And last night, this project was going on opposite the World Series and Michael Jordan's return to basketball. And the fact is that Michael Jordan is like an artist in the sense that in order to do the thing he does, it requires total concentration. And very importantly, because a friend of mine in Louisiana, and I taught for 15 years before I came here to Florida State University. I taught for 15 years in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And a good friend over at LSU, who was the assistant athletic director, his name is Greg LaFleur, and he used to be the tight end for the St. Louis Cardinals football team, National Football League team. They moved on to Arizona, and we got the Rams. But when there was the Cardinals in town, Greg was the tight end for, nearly a decade. He was a really good one. And Greg and I occasionally have talked about how what he used to do and what I do are very similar in a certain way. He had to be in the zone in order to do this incredibly impossible thing, to run as fast as he can down a football field, 3 guys converging on you, ready to crush the life out of your body. And meanwhile, Jim Ray Hart, I guess, was his quarterback. This guy throws this bizarrely shaped object into the air, and you're running, and you throw your body out, you look over your shoulder, and you throw your body out and extend your hand, and the ball lands on your fingertips, and you pull it into you and you catch it. Now, how do you do such a thing? Well, the fact is, the way you do not do it is to think about it. The rational, analytical mind destroys the ability to do it. That's what the athlete being in the zone means, the casting out of the conscious, willful, analytical mind. The artist must do the same thing. Though the artist zone is even more difficult and demanding than the athlete zone. And I'll give you an example. Let's go back to Michael Jordan. And when Michael at his peak, I haven't seen him play yet this year, and I don't know if he still can defy gravity in quite the way he used to, but when Michael Jordan used to receive the ball at the head of the key, lift off from the earth, fly to the basket, and roll that ball into the basket, in order to do it, in every basket that Michael Jordan made, he had to be in the zone. But to make that athlete zone, to make Michael Jordan's zone fully analogous to the artist zone, we have to add something. And that is that every time Michael Jordan made a basket, and in order to make a basket, he would have to confront the moment where his father's chest was blown apart by that shotgun held by his kidnapper. I mean, this happened. Drove Michael Jordan out of basketball and into baseball for a while. But the artist zone requires exactly that. Michael Jordan and all the athletes, to be in their zone, they've got to get rid of their analytical mind, but they do not have to go into their unconscious. They do not have to go in their dream space. They go into their muscle memory. They go into their bodies. Now, the artist must go into her body as well, because creation of a work of art is an entirely sensual thing. But the artist must also, in order to write, in order to be in the zone where the writing comes from, must also go into her unconscious and be open to all of the horrors and passions and aspirations and losses and all all that incredibly intense, roiling mix of all of your deepest feelings. You have to go in there and you can't flinch. The great Japanese film director Akira Kurosawa once said that to be an artist means never to avert your eyes. And that's, he's describing this very thing I'm talking about, because that place is scary as hell. And it's interesting. Last night, I was not in, and of course you have to be in a certain zone to teach as well. I don't want to look at the tape of last night, because in these moments I speak to you, I felt at times I was fumbling and saying things awkwardly that I usually can say more effectively. Right now I feel like I'm kind of in the teaching zone, better than last night, not perfect. But the fact is, I never had a chance last night, and I have not had a chance tonight, a little bit now, and maybe some, but I think I was in each of the two zones, but I was in one and then out of it and in the other one and out of it and in the other one. And that's the thing, Melanie, that is difficult here and artificial. But I'm doing it, and that's the kind of going over Niagara in a barrel part of this whole project. But I'm doing it in order to try to bring some light to this process. And I did not walk away last night, and probably won't tonight either, feeling as, because the thing about that wonderful kind of feeling of, I don't know, it's a kinesthetic thing. It's a sense of openness, giving, whatever. I was doing it, I think, in both the teaching mode and in the creating mode, but I was toggling back and forth between them, and so I did not walk away from this office with that sense of release, that sense of having sustained a certain concentration through the whole time. I was going between two quite different sorts of concentrations, and that's kind of an important thing to understand. So that was a good question, Melanie. Okay. Question from Mimi Carmen. Since you seem to develop your character-oriented story as you write, do you ever sense the ending before you start? I believe endings should have epiphanies. Do you know what that change will be before you start writing? I believe in epiphanies too, Mimi. You understand epiphany is the term that James Joyce coined or appropriated from the Catholic Church. It literally means a shining forth. And his sense of fiction as an art form was that the piece of fiction moves to that moment of shining forth, where something shines forth in its essence. But the answer is no. I do not know the endings before I start. They are character-oriented. My stories and novels are character-oriented. My process begins with character. And as I mentioned last night, it begins with that absolutely crucial thing that I like to call yearning. Characters yearn, and that's at the heart of every piece of narrative fiction. And once I'm in touch with that character's yearning, then everything else follows, and everything else shapes itself around that. But it's a matter of exploring as I go. It really is, as you pointed out. Indeed, I think there's a distinction between literature and non-literature. You may often wonder, why isn't Stephen King, for example, considered to be an artist? Why is he not creating literature? And I would put in this example I'm about to give you, not only Stephen King on the one hand, but also, let's say, Jean-Paul Sartre as novelist. Non-art, and by that I do not mean to suggest some sort of hierarchy or, the works that fall outside of what I think is a useful understanding of what art is. Those works are not therefore lesser or inconsiderable. They could be wonderfully entertaining and diverting and recreating and in the sense of recreation, which we all need to be recreated through our recreation. They could be provocative and intelligent and even profound intellectually. But those things that fall out of the realm of art do so, I believe, because those who write those works, they know before they begin to write exactly the effects that they wish to have on their readers. Before a word is written, it is known the effects that they wish to have, emotional effects, intellectual effects. Stephen King wants to scare the hell out of you. He knows that before word one is written. Jean-Paul Sartre wants to scare the hell out of you, but he also wants to prove the cosmic verities of existentialism as a mode of philosophical thought. And so both King and Sartre then construct objects that will have those effects on the readers. The artist does not know. The artist does not know what effects she will have on her readers. She does not know what philosophical implications might reside in her object that she creates. All she knows is that in her unconscious there is a character who yearns. And all she knows then is that around that character and around the story in which that character will yearn, there exists a vision of the world that she, the artist, deeply senses as true in some universal way about the human condition. But it's a sense, it's a vision of order and meaning behind the apparent chaos of things that can be understood only in the act of creating the object. The artist doesn't know, for she must create the object in order to know. For the artist, the creation of the work of art, the writing of the novel, the story, is as much an act of exploration as it is of expression. And so if you decide what the ending of the story is before you begin, it's you remove, you embrace the non-artistic process. The object is organic, and everything within it will resonate into everything else, and the ending is unknowable in a work of art until its place in the full object is arrived at. Okay, from S. Piernan, you're opening with the most dramatic event. How will you keep the tension up? This is a good observation. We have the fall of the plane. But again, I'm not anticipating what the end will be. I don't know what the most dramatic event will be. It will be hard to top a plane crash. That does not mean because if the plane crashes in the opening moments that you have to have then a bigger crash at the end. The work of art, the arc of the narrative, the rising importance, which let's use that if we can instead of tension, because tension is a perhaps too confining term in a sense. It gives the wrong impression. But you are right that there is in a good work of narrative a sense of build. Rising action is what it might be called, and those who analyze the elements of plot. But the falling airplane is not, that is the most climactic event only in a work in which is concerned with that as the full as the culmination of the deepest vision of that work. This work is its tension, its build is going to be on some other scale. A scale of the human heart, a scale of, I think, the ways in which a man yearns to come to terms with death for himself and for his own understanding of the world, without abstracting too much here. And we've got that paradox going here, that schizophrenia. But I think the rising action in this story will be on a different scale, in which the fall of a plane is just the beginning. Our world did not climax with that United Airlines flight and that American airline flight flying into the Twin Towers. It just began. Our story is gathering even now, though that would be a hard event to top. I do not feel like things have now become anticlimactic in this world. And I think that's a connection that may be somehow resonating out of this very image that I chose to begin this story. When you sit down to write, how do you get to that place you dream? How do you get into the trance? Well, certainly an important aspect of that is what I mentioned earlier. You go there every day. I've been doing this a long time. In between stories, I'm very restless, especially when a story is about to happen, and I get very down on myself. My wife says, well, you finally passed into the stage of self-loathing, so you're about to write. It's okay, honey. I'm encouraged by your self-loathing because you're about to write a story or a novel. So the work itself creates its own dream, and the dream finally is shaped enough in your unconscious that it demands expression. One little trick, if you have not gotten into your dream space and you want some ways in which you might help facilitate that, I'd recommend this. You need to turn into a morning person. And just set aside, and if you have other commitments during the day, and most of us do, then you set aside, you know what time you have to be out in the world doing whatever else you have to do. and you walk back from that, the amount of time you want to write, and I think it should be at least an hour, and under ideal circumstances, probably 2. But whatever time you can write, let's say an hour and a half. So you walk back from when you have to leave the house to do other things, you walk back an hour and a half. Then you walk back the amount of time that you need to get ready to walk out of the house. And that's the time you set your alarm for, and you get up. And when you get up from your literal dreams, now I'm not suggesting that you use literal dreams. I've never used one of my actual nighttime fast asleep dreams. I've never used one as a basis of a piece of fiction. But the place where you are when you are asleep and dreaming, that place in yourself is a place very much in the same vicinity where you must go to create a work of art. And so you wake up, and if the coffee timer, if you need coffee, you put the timer on, because you wake up, you grab that cup of coffee, and you go straight to work. And you do nothing else. You might stop at the restroom, but bathroom break, grab the coffee, and you go to work. And you go to work in a space where you do your creative writing, and you go into your trance there. That's very helpful before the rest of the world intervenes, because once you get out in the world each day, you're apt to find that you're drawn up into your mind, into your analytical faculties. We spend most of our days there, and we need to. Without, if you spend all of your days, if you in that weltering trance of dream state, you're going to go crazy. So you have to leave it in your writing room. But by the same token, the rest of the day, the rest of the world will draw you up into the place that you've got to get out of to create. So it might help you then to do it first thing in the morning, before the rest of the world can intervene, and while you have quite recently been a part of that other trance place, which is from your sleep. L.G. Newman in Rhode Island asks, can a metaphor run the risk of interrupting the flow of a story? Absolutely. In fact, you saw, if you were here last night, or if you want to replay the archive, there was a metaphor last night that interrupted the flow of the story. One I kept was when he watches Sant's plane go by at first. He sees him sitting, and the early aviators did sort of attach regular chairs to their planes. And he sees Sant in a rattan chair, as if he were sitting on his porch smoking a cigar. Then later in the story, when the plane begins to go down, if you go back to the archive, you'll see that for a time I went back. The narrator watched Sant fall out of his chair as if he were getting up off the porch after finishing his cigar and so forth. And that whole metaphor returned and indeed began to interrupt the flow of the story, because we're watching that plane fall, or our narrator is. And this metaphor returned and started trivializing and interrupting the flow. So you're absolutely right. That can happen, and you need to guard against it. We have time for one more quick question. Thomas Bruder in Germantown, Tennessee said, why did the voice of the observer and not Earl Sant resonate most clearly? As I think I mentioned, when I first bought the card, I thought it would be Earl Sant resonating most clearly. But honestly, and I didn't understand this, and by the way, believe me, if I were writing this story in the privacy of my own home, this connection with September 11th would never have come up to the consciousness of my mind, and I'm constantly trying to put it aside. But I think that the observer resonates most clearly, and why this story is deeply connecting to my unconscious now is because we were all the observers in the fall of a plane back on September 11th. We were all observers of, in some intense way, of the moment of death. And I think we all have confronted anew our sense of what death is and how we can come to terms with that. None of us had a frame of reference for what we saw concerning a plane crashing. And I think that's what's in this card, and that's why it's connecting so deeply into my unconscious, and why the observer's voice is the one that I'm drawn to most intensely, and not simply Earl Sants. Okay, we have had another good session tonight, and I'm very happy for your questions. I encourage you to email me with any questions or comments that you have as we go forward in this story. And so, this ends another night of Inside Creative Writing. Please join us again tomorrow night at 9 p.m. When we'll return to this narrator's voice and see where our story leads us. Thank you very much, and good night.